Here's a question for you. What increases vulnerability to psychological disorders and disease, increases the likelihood of excessive self-criticism, markedly increases the risk of anxiety and depression, leads to suppressed emotional response, leads to alexithymia, which is a diminished capacity to recognize and describe emotions within oneself and other people, impedes mindfulness, increases cardiovascular risk, and imposes a risk factor to physical health greater than a lifetime of smoking. Answer: fear of accepting compassion. Compassion avoidance. It's a thing, and it can kill you. Now, we have a saying where I come from, as independent as a hog on ice, which expresses despair at someone that they'll ever take any help whatsoever. We can't do nothing. She's as independent as a hog on ice. Well, what do hogs on ice do, you wonder, in case you haven't raised hogs? Well, the way to get a hog to go somewhere is to use a long stick, and you follow along behind. And when the hog goes the correct way, you don't do anything. And when they go the wrong way, you take the stick and you tap them on the side to get them to go back the other way. It's kind of like a dance, actually, but when a hog gets on ice and feels itself falling, all that goes out the window. It won't pay any more heed to the stick. It's only thinking about self-preservation, and so there's nothing you can do about it. Being as independent as a hog on ice is being someone beyond help because you won't accept help. It's compassion avoidance, and it's a thing, and it can kill you. Now, here's one of those spiritual laws that I talk about once in a while. If you can't take help, says the spiritual law, you can't give help. If you can't accept compassion, you can't give compassion. And Maya Angelou says it well here. When we give cheerfully and accept gratefully, everyone is blessed. Angelou's insight is that compassion is not a one-way street. Compassion is a two-way street. Now, there's a newer kind of therapy that's being called compassion-focused therapy. And the research on this is very clear. People who fail to be compassionate are people who suffer from shame and or self-criticism. People who suffer shame or people who have that inner critic turned up to number 11. They can't feel compassion. And again, the message is clear. In order to be a compassionate person, you've got to have some compassion for yourself. You've got to change your way of thinking. Now, last week, I diagnosed the current problems in our nation with a massive failure of compassion. And there are historical reasons for this failure of compassion. There are philosophical and theological reasons for this failure of compassion. When it comes down to the American mindset, well, we insist upon individualism, don't we? We come down on that being independent as a hog on ice, as some sort of good thing, something that we should strive for. Well, you know, that's a total lie. It's what we call compassion avoidance, and it can kill you. And because, as I've said before, there is bad theology, and bad theology can be very damaging. In Christian tradition, what's been treated as mystical experiences are very individualistic in the way that they are described and experienced. The archetypal Christian mystical experience was reported by Paul in the second book of Corinthians, chapter 12, and he wrote this: I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. And I know that such a person, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, not that no mortal is permitted to repeat, end quote. And Paul is following a pattern here. What he experienced is so strange that he doesn't know if it was all in his head or if it actually happened in the physical world. He's had this vision. What he hears cannot be communicated. It's somehow inexpressible. And Paul relates this experience not because he has some new insight to relate, but it's a way of authenticating his holiness quotient, if you will. Paul's faux humble, I know a guy, tells us volumes about Paul's ego formations, and what it tells us is not good. Such mystical experiences convince the one who experiences them and might even impress other people, but the experiencer brings nothing back from that experience except maybe personal conviction. But the experience feels very expansive, even boundless, but it is still centered on the individual, the ego. Mystical experiences of that sort can feel great, the boundless feeling, a feeling of being one with everything, but what do they do more than burnish your spiritual resume? In the imagination, this kind of experience can be turned around. And I was talking about that last week as a Buddhist practice that teaches compassion by turning this around so that it's not about me, but about us. Instead of the feeling of oneness radiating out from my center out into the universe, we turn that around, and it is that I am receiving this, and that then I become part of this vast fabric of the universe. I'm a little strand and a little thread in this whole fabric, and I want to be a contributing part of that. And that's what Buddhism teaches us in Taoism about how to interpret this experience. The great Buddhist monk Santideva calls this the exchange of self and other. The exchange of self and other. Santideva writes, "See yourself as you once saw others. That is, not much or not at all. See others as you once saw yourself, as everything is of ultimate importance." And then Santideva goes on to write this, "Whatever suffering there is in the world flows from the wish for your own happiness. Whatever happiness there is in the world flows from the wish for happiness for others." Now, that's a fairly straightforward spiritual truth, I think. Ideally, mystical experience, meditative experiences, we should have those and experience those as a way of finding ourselves within the fabric of the wider universe. Last week I talked about how for humanists, the encounter with the other is our baseline for how we do our ethics and set up our ideals, the encounter with the other. And actually, that's exactly what Ibram K. Kendi talks about in the reading from this morning. Dr. Kendi is a historian, and this fall, as a matter of fact, Kendi will launch the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. If you haven't read his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, go read it ASAP. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. From the reading, notice how Kendi phrases this, quote, "One either allows racial inequalities to persever as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space to be called not racist." That's from the introduction of the book. A little bit earlier in the introduction, Kendi writes this, Americans have long been trained to see the deficiencies of people rather than of policy. It's a pretty easy mistake to make. People are in our faces. Policies are distant. We are particularly poor at seeing the policies lurking behind the struggles of people, end quote. How to Be an Anti-Racist is a particularly good book for humanists, I think, to read on this subject, because the center of Kindi's thesis is that racism is a set of unexamined beliefs. He says this explicitly, quote, "Racist ideas love believers, not thinkers." We humanists think that it's incumbent upon us to examine our beliefs. We strive to be thinkers, not believers. Racism is a set of unexamined prejudices and assumptions created by a particular set of cultural circumstances, and that can be questioned. We live in a nation with a constitution written to ensure that captured Africans could be enslaved and prevented from becoming citizens. Yet, 150 years ago, along came the 13th Amendment, which made men of African origin citizens. They became African Americans. It's been nearly 60 years since the last laws to explicitly enforce white supremacy were finally removed from the books, laws specifically designed to ensure that African Americans did not enjoy the full benefits of citizenship. It's been more than 150 years since Abraham Lincoln talked about the proposition that all men are created equal. We are still treating that as a debatable proposition, not as a truth. But equality is not debatable. One of my favorite definitions of humanism is by the Bulgarian philosopher Setvin Todorov. And he says this, it's a little bit professory, but I'll unwrap it a bit. Humanism is the autonomy of the I, the finality of you, and the universality of the they. The autonomy of the I, the finality of the you, and the universality of the they. That's where compassion comes from. I am free to choose compassion rather than hate. I recognize the finality of you. You are a free agent who is able to strive for those things you wish to strive for. And the finality of that you goes into the universality of the they. We choose compassion rather than hate because we understand that all compassion is self-compassion, because all of us are in this vast fabric of reality together. I personally choose to be anti-racist because I choose to be a thinker, not a believer. As Dr. Kindi says, racist ideas love believers, not thinkers. I want to give great thanks to Minneapolis artist Brother Ali for giving us permission to play his brilliant song, Letter to My Countrymen. In that song, Brother Ali hones the terrible question down to a sharp point and names his sorrow for those not only betrayed by a nation, but also still mercilessly exploited by a nation. What are the choices? One choice is endless rebellion. Perhaps that's even the choice that feels the most authentic and the most true to one's principles. But Brother Ali understands that question that I talked about last week that Alexander Hamilton asked. Is it going to be a government of reflection and choice or of accident and force? Brother Ali chooses reflection and choice. He writes, "It's home, so we better make the best of it. I want to make this country what it says it is. And he goes on. We're still not even close to really sharing things. The situation of oppressed people shows what we feel it means to be a human being. What does it mean to be American? I think the struggle to be free is our inheritance. Brother Ali brings in the voice of Dr. Cornel West at the end of that song. I would argue that Dr. West is one of the great liberation theologians of our time, probably the greatest. West says too, Brother Ali, you don't want to be just well-adjusted to injustice and well-adapted to indifference. You want to be a person with integrity who leaves a mark on the world. Cornel West asks us to examine our lives because the unexamined life leads to the mindset that Dr. Kendi mentions. Racist ideas love believers, not thinkers. And I feel Brother Ali's words very deeply personally because I've struggled with the feelings of rebellion a lot in my life. Emma's Revolution this morning, the first part of that song says, my parents always told me work hard and stay in school, trust the church and leaders of our town. For me, that was not my experience. I was taught to distrust government and leaders and authority. My birth religion, Pentecostalism, was all about burn it down. Government and authority was the principalities and powers that were in the hands of the evil and of Satan. And I've outgrown that, I hope, learned new things, but as my wife will tell you, often when I'm listening to the news, my first reaction still is that gut reaction of, they're all crooks. We need to have a revolution. But I hope I've come, at least mentally, to the point that I believe in not accident and force, but about reason and thought. And slow, change. It's painful sometimes, but peaceful change actually benefits the most people. But I know that there are a scary number of Americans who still believe, as I did for many years, left or right, fascist or anarchist, carrying guns and burning things down and hoping that some sort of cleansing violence will finally make things right. It just can't work. The older I get, the more I know that Hamilton's reflection and choice are the only viable options. Reflection, choice, and compassion. As we saw a couple of weeks ago at the White House, oppressors know violence very well, and they do it very well. That is not our way, and it's not the way forward. It's difficult to see that deeper truth about things, but Brother Ali, in another of his songs, writes this: because the children can't escape from the pain, and they're born with poisonous hatred in their veins, try and separate a man from his soul. You only strengthen him and lose your own. That is a deep spiritual truth. In these dark days, have some compassion on yourself. Take care of yourself. As Maya Angelou says, compassion is the best sort of two-way street. Give and take. Compassion avoidance isolates us from the meaning and purpose of life. We can't avoid compassion and be healthy, helpful people. The humanist proposition is that human beings can solve human problems. The problem to be solved for us now is crystal clear. At the very birth of humanism, humanists demanded that we have a shared life in a shared world. And Brother Ali is speaking truth when he says we're still not even close to sharing things. Well, we know we've got to get close. closer. He's also correct about what it means to be an American, I think. Like it or not, the struggle to be free and to make everyone free is our inheritance and our obligation. Yes, Americans have inherited a constitution written to ensure that captured Africans could be enslaved and prevented from citizenship. Yes, it's been nearly 60 years since the last laws to explicitly enforce white supremacy were finally stricken from the books, but many of those old laws still exist in other forms. Yes, it's been more than 150 years since Abraham Lincoln talked about the proposition that all men are created equal. And yes, we are still treating that as a debatable proposition, not as a truth. That is a failure of basic compassion. Still, and because, even with all of the injustice in American history, we must continue the struggle to be free, the struggle to make everyone free. That is our inheritance. Until we meet again, be fearless, ask questions, hold on to what is good, strengthen the weak, comfort the fearful, serve the suffering, do what makes you come alive. Rejoice in the power of the human spirit. So may it be. Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.